Hi, everyone. Please turn to page 43 in your Pew Bible. So I'll be reading from Psalm 104, verses 1 through 6, and also 24 through 25. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment. You stretched out the heavens like a tent. You set the beams of your chambers on the waters. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. You make the wind your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. You set the earth on its foundations so that it shall never be taken. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yonder is the sea, great and wide. Creeping things innumerable are there, living things both small and great. There go the ships, and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it.
The second reading is from the 12th chapter of Job, verses 7 to 10, and you'll find that on page 400 in your Bibles. But ask the animals, and they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In God's hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. This is the holy word. Thanks be to God.
Before I started elementary school, I stayed with my grandmother during the day while my parents were working. And I remember the window in my grandmother's bedroom that I would go to at a certain time during the day to meet my friend Joey. Joey and I would sit at the window and stare at each other through the glass for long periods of time. And I would talk to him, and he would look back at me as we met one another at this particular window on a pretty regular basis over time. Joey didn't say anything, as he was a squirrel, but there was a sense of relational reciprocity between us, demonstrated at very least by the fact that both of us kept returning to that window day after day for some time. I did have human friends, in case you're wondering, but I had animal ones too, like Joey. And I'll bet many of you can think back to your own childhoods and recall special relationships that you formed, not just with household pets, but with things in the wild, squirrels, and birds, and other animals, but perhaps also special trees with which you spent significant time or to which you told your secrets, or with particular places in the woods near your house where you would go to be alone and spend time in imaginative space that felt somehow different to you than when you were sitting in your bedroom or on the school playground. I want to invite you to think back just for a second. Just think back for a moment about these relationships you had as a child with the more than human. A month or so ago, students at Union Theological Seminary in a class together there were leading a chapel service that drew so much outrage and criticism on social media that it was covered in major news outlets like the Washington Post. This was just a daily chapel service at the seminary. And Christian ministers from all over the country tweeted claims of heresy and paganism and loss of touch with Christian tradition and even loss of minds among those at this storied seminary. And Jim spent a year there, so that explains something about him. The students are taught by a professor named Claudio Carvajalis, who was also the worship leader this past year at the Alliance of Baptists annual gathering in D.C. And the course that these students were taking is called Creating Rituals in Community, the Work of Mourning the Earth. In this particular worship service, the students designed and led. The worshiping community sat in the round with a small patch of dirt in the middle, right in the center of the chapel, with 8 or 10 large potted plants sitting atop the soil. And during the service, students were invited to come to the front of the space before a microphone, facing the plants and all of the onlooking worshipers, and they would make confessions to the plants. They would say things to the plants like this: I confess that so many trees held me in their branches as I grew, but I have not held you in return. It was a way in worship to draw plants into the worshiping community of creation, not just as objects for human use and exploitation, but as participants in the gift of life. It was a ritual that recognized the pain and remorse of humanity's sin of participation in the decimation of so much other than human life. So much sin that is now contributing to the collapse of the climate and the destruction of forests and the extinction of species. And it should be disturbing to us how much vitriol this act of Christian ritual drew from pastors all over the country, disparaging the act and the students and the faculty who cultivated this service. It is hard to fathom with what language the psalmist of today's text could have praised the Creator, if not with the language of light and waters and clouds and wind and flame, or with the images of thunder and mountains and valleys and springs and streams, or by drawing into the praise of the divine the voices of cattle and plants and trees and birds and rocks and sun and moon and sea. And yet, claims of absolute theological bankruptcy, that's a quote, and utter nonsense and insanity spilled forth on social media from primarily, as far as I can tell, men in pulpits around the country. This is All Saints Sunday, when we remember the dead and their impacts on our lives, when we mark the lives that have shaped this community and the larger Christian community and the world at large in their legacy of service and ministry, of justice and of honoring the creation. And we take into account their loss from among us and what it means for us to go on pursuing our sense of call with their absent presence as they join the communion of saints from age to age. Every one of those people that you named earlier in the litany. And I wonder on this All Saints Sunday in a church that strives to honor our place as a part of earth and not apart from the earth, what it would mean to expand our sense of belongingness to a larger communion, not just of saints and souls, of human companions, but of symbiotic relationships to the more than human that are part of our very own bodies in ways that we can't even see and without which we cannot know life. How would we honor our grieving of species that are now dead, lost from among us? What gaps do they leave in our own symbiotic relationships to the human and the more than human world? Page 9 in your bulletin names a few of these species as we that we witnessed move toward extinction last year, and even more at the bottom of that page that are being taken from us in the very near future, primarily by human actions like poaching and deforestation and the introduction of invasive species and the effects of climate collapse. So on a more expansive All Saints Sunday, this little passage from the book of Job that we read this morning might take on a new meaning for us. We might read it as more than an annual blessing of the animals text, which is where it is often relegated. But ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In God's hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. The passage is beautiful poetry all on its own. But when you add a contextual understanding to this passage, rich theological depth emerges. You probably know enough about the figure of Job to know that he had lost everything. His wealth was all gone. His children are all dead. His health is in shambles. And his best wish is that he had never been born. And a large portion of the book is comprised of Job's friends coming to comfort him as best they knew how, often with theological wisdom that was supposed to have helped Job understand his plight and trust in God. This is largely, in hindsight, not a good strategy for pastoral care. One of Job's friends, a real theologian, is Zophar, who speaks to Job in the previous chapter of this book, saying in all earnestness, "But oh, that God would speak and open God's lips to you, Job, and that God would tell you the secrets of wisdom. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea." Basically, he says, Job, I pray that God will impart to you secret wisdom that is accessible only in the farthest reaches of existence, places higher than heaven and deeper than Sheol and longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Gerald Jansen says in this passage, Zophar has claimed that God's infinite wisdom transcends the cosmos. One of Job's other friends, named Bildad, emerges in an earlier chapter saying to Job, "For inquire now of bygone generations and consider what their ancestors have found. For we are but of yesterday, and we know nothing. For our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you and utter words out of their understanding?" In other words, Job, ask the communion of saints from age to age for their wisdom, and surely out of the accumulated wisdom of every generation, you could come to understand the presence of the divine in all of this terrible mess you're in. And it's out of this context that the subversive theological message of Job's words comes through. Job, in the depths of despair and desperation and dejection, looks at his friends in the eye, knowing that they're doing the best that they can do to help, but they can't seem to say anything that matters. And Job, after all the lofty theological words about the infinite wisdom of the divine that transcends the cosmos and reaching back into the wisdom of the saints from every age, says, "Why is any of this necessary, my friends? But ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? And in God's hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being." And his theological case is wrested. No appeal to secret sources of wisdom or humanity of past generation needs to be made for answers that cannot come from the interwoven tapestry of life that holds pitiful Job within its nest. Animals and birds and plants and fish. Ask them, and they will teach you. You of deep theological insight from on high and accumulated wisdom from the ages. In verse 8, your Pew Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, translates Job's words, "Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you." But a literal translation of the Hebrew there would be something more like this: "Speak to the earth, and it will teach you." Speak to the earth, and it will teach you. Have you ever heard a message like this from the biblical text before? As many times as you've heard, "Fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over every living thing," have you ever in your life heard with equal fervor preached the words, "Ask the animals, ask the birds, ask the plants, ask the fish, and they will teach you"? Speak to the earth. They will be your teachers. So I want to invite you to try something. The next few weeks, all the way until November 24th, we are engaging in this theological exploration titled Creation, Creativity, and the Cosmos. So there are 4 full weeks left until we enter together into the season of Advent. So for those next 4 weeks, I want to invite you to form a new relationship. There are only 2 stipulations for the development of this relationship. It can't be with a human being. And it shouldn't be with something that lives with you in your house. So aside from your own pets and your house plants and things of that nature, things that you already have a particular kind of relationship with, choose something more than human out in the world that surrounds you. A tree that you pass by on a regular basis on your walk to work, a flock of geese that inhabits the pond near your house, a large outcropping of stone close by, a body of water that's close enough for you to visit on a regular basis. Choose a more than human entity that is a part of your larger ecosystem that you have no control over, like the flowers in your garden or the dog that you walk around on your leash, because you already have a certain type of relationship to those beings. Form a relationship for the next 4 weeks, a spiritual experiment with something that is simply there, existing alongside you in the larger communion of symbiotic relationships between the human and the more than human. Ask, speak. And that's what I want to ask you to do. Talk to it. Really and truly talk to it. Ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Might be the one time in your lives when you're being biblical literalists here. Confess what needs confessing. Share the secrets that you need to tell the more than human. Express the joys that being in communion with that entity brings to your life. Make your commitments to the struggle for the survivability of earth, not into the larger than life void, but make those commitments to this being that exists alongside you in this life space. And then, perhaps even harder, listen. I know many of us don't have the cultivated sense of how to listen to aspects of the landscape that surrounds us like so many indigenous communities throughout the world do, but this is an opportunity to practice. As silly or as impossible as it may seem to you right now, It might seem difficult to listen to an entity that doesn't have a voice like the voices we're accustomed to hearing. But in a very palpable way, that's kind of what it's like to listen to God, too, isn't it? Form a relationship with a being that is more than human. Whether we would consider it living or not, it is interwoven into the fabric of life. Talk to that more than human being with honesty and intention. Listen to that entity that exists alongside you in the larger communion of symbiotic relationship, and let it be your teacher. That's the spiritual discipline for this season that we've created for this last stretch of the church's liturgical year, the season of creation, creativity, and the cosmos. Because in your despair over climate collapse, and in your desperation to do something that will make a difference for the survivability of the interwoven tapestry of life on this planet, and even in your most depressed and despondent and dejected states, when nothing seems to be making a difference and nothing else seems to matter, you do well to take the advice of Job, who knew despair and desperation and depression and despondency and dejection more than any other figure in that long communion of saints. And his advice is simple. Speak to the earth.